Dispatch. My wife is dead. I just came home. And she's in the bedroom and she's been stabbed. Oh my God. Oh my God.
The caller was Charlie Jensen, and the dead woman on the floor of the bedroom in his home in the woods was his wife, Linda Jensen, age 39 and mother of 3. Linda Jensen was described as a beautiful, free spirit. As a child, she loved to go fast. She rode horses, ran track, and more than anything, she loved speed skating. She was passionate and loved life. She had an ideal childhood growing up in Minneapolis with her 3 siblings. When Linda is just 18 years old, she marries her childhood sweetheart, Charlie Jensen. Linda and Charlie got married on April 4th of 1971, which was 2 months before her 19th birthday. They couldn't have been happier, but the couple's happiness doesn't last. As happens in a lot of marriages, things went south, and after 7 years, they got divorced. Linda becomes a dental hygienist, and a few years later, starts a relationship with a local man named Robert Beard. Together, they have a son named Joey. However, this marriage would be short-lived. Linda said that Robert had been abusive, and she quickly took herself and Joey far away from him. Linda married a 3rd time, this time to John Silliman in 1986, and the couple moved to California. Joey was only a couple of years old, and Silliman formally adopted him when he and Linda got married. For a 3rd time, Linda found herself in a toxic marriage with a man who had changed after they tied the knot. After 2 years of marriage to John, she filed for divorce and moved back to Minnesota to be closer to her parents and siblings. Also nearby was her first husband, Charlie Jensen, and the two rekindled their romance. Charlie was now sober and had turned his life around, reminding Linda of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. In 1990, the two revealed to their family that they wanted to get remarried, which is what they did on April 4th, 1991, on what would have been their 20th wedding anniversary. The two gave birth to their 2nd child together, Lisa, months later. Charlie was the love of her life, and her kids were the apple of her eye, and she was just in a fantastic spot in her life. But that beautiful life would soon be cut short. February 24th begins like any other day in the Jensen home. Charlie, a contractor, leaves early for work while Linda tends to the kids. He arrived at work on time and was seen by co-workers, who also confirmed he hadn't left until later that afternoon. Joey, her son, left for the bus around 8:30 a.m. Charlie calls Linda around 9:45 a.m. and was concerned when no one answered. He called again around noon, and a 3rd time in the mid-afternoon. Around 4 p.m. on February 24, 1992, Charlie Jensen returned to the remote home in Big Lake, Minnesota that he shared with his wife and children. When he got to the house, he found his young children alone and upset. He called out for his wife Linda, but no one answered. The children were confused, but fine. 9-year-old Joey was at the kitchen table having just returned home from school and was doing homework. However, Charlie noticed that their 8-month-old daughter was in a playpen, wearing the same clothing that she'd slept in. He searched the home and noticed that a kitchen knife was missing, and then he saw their bedroom door was closed, which he thought was odd. He opened the door and discovered his wife Linda on the floor. She was naked, but covered with their comforter, which was soaked with blood. Linda had been stabbed multiple times, with the knife still embedded in her chest through the comforter, pinning it to her body. Charlie called 911. Detectives from the Sherburne County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene. There had been no sign of forced entry, and law enforcement believed that someone had come to the door and forced their way inside when Linda opened it. There had been no sign of anything stolen or that the home had been searched, so the motive was determined to be exclusively to attack Linda. Deputies saw Linda's body under the comforter over the top of her with a kitchen knife stuck into her chest area. While forensic examiners processed the body for detectives scour the house for additional clues. There was no sign of forcible entry. There was nothing out of place. The sheets from the bed have been removed. The perpetrator was trying to ensure the fact that there was no evidence left on the sheets. A logical conclusion: Linda had been sexually assaulted, but detectives have no idea who brutally murdered this young mother. Was it somebody that she knew? There was a lot of rage to do that type of injury to this young lady. It was a very gruesome act of a very demented individual. 39-year-old Linda Jensen was raped and murdered in her Big Lake home. The child, Lisa, was just feet from where she sat in her playpen. The gruesome murder has stunned this small Minnesota town as police search for a violent predator. The fact that the weapon is from the scene and the lack of any forced entry into the house led the police to believe that whoever had assaulted and murdered Linda might be somebody that she knew or recognized. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood for leads in this close-knit community. Police learned that Linda Jensen was a good, average American woman. She took good care of her children. She took good care of herself. She was also an avid jogger. Police find nothing suspicious about Linda's character, so they focused their questions around the morning of her attack. Unfortunately, nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. And so, there was nothing there to go on. With no witnesses to the crime, police turned to the autopsy for insight into Linda's final moments. The medical examiner was able to find seminal fluid, and this confirmed Linda Jensen had been sexually assaulted. But in 1992, DNA testing was still being developed, and the sample collected wasn't large enough to give police a hit initially, but the lack of blood spatter at the crime scene suggests she was already dead before she was stabbed. The medical examiner saw the bruising on her neck, and then he wanted to make sure she was dead, and that's where the knife came in. He went in and just mutilated her. This was personal. 4 days after the murder, the family gathers at Linda's funeral to mourn the devastating loss. As Linda's loved ones struggle with their grief, police turn their attention to another member of her family. The person who finds the body is generally somebody who is high up on the list. Charlie Jensen is brought to the police station for questioning. What they started out with was to have Charlie just kind of account for his activities from the time he woke up in the morning until he called 911. Charlie and she got up in the morning. Charlie left for work fairly early. He was in the construction business. And when he left the house, Joey was home, and Charlie, he had to initially go out to Rogers to pick up some building supplies and then went to a job site in Maplewood, Minnesota, which is on the eastern half of the Twin Cities. The autopsy confirms that Linda's time of death was between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. Charlie is adamant. He did not see or speak with his wife after leaving the house that morning. Police want to verify Charlie's phone records and his whereabouts at the time of Linda's murder. They also retraced Charlie's steps during the same time in the morning, so the traffic conditions are similar, so they'd know how much time that would take for him to make those various stops and to travel between those places. Investigators must also consider if Charlie had any motive to kill his wife. Obviously, Charlie and Linda had been married once and then divorced and then remarried again. We want to know what's the nature of the relationship. As police continue to dissect Charlie's alibi, they receive a tip that points them in a new direction. A witness came forward after the police were asking for information from the general public. A week after Linda Jensen is found brutally murdered in her home, a witness reports a green truck fleeing the scene. When that tip came in, they thought they had something. This witness might help identify a potential suspect. Detectives bring in the witness to describe the man she saw driving the green truck. The police start to look at people who may have some connection to the case or the family to see does they resemble somebody who has a connection here. The image doesn't match any of Linda's known acquaintances, so police released the composite sketch to the public. This was a fairly generic description. Nobody called in saying that they knew this guy or who resembled anybody. As the police's only real lead stalls, Linda's family grows increasingly frustrated, and the police determine that Charlie is telling the truth, that he had been to all the places he was. Ultimately, police determined that there was nothing that suggested that there was a motive for murder there. Police asked, "Who do you think might have done this?" And the one person that Charlie Jensen did suggest to the police was Robert Beard. Robert Beard is Joey's father. Investigators found out from Charlie 2 weeks before the homicide that there was an argument on the phone. Charlie had indicated that he could be forceful, that he had a propensity to be violent. Police look at his background. They want to know if he's had any arrests, if he'd been convicted of anything, where he lives and works. Investigators have a new suspect in the vicious killing of Linda Jensen, an ex-boyfriend with a temper. He and Linda were having custody issues, and they took the information about Beard seriously enough that they thought he might have been responsible for her death. Investigators bring Robert Beard in for questioning. Robert denies having anything to do with Linda's death and provides police with an alibi. He said he was home all day long. He had no transportation to get to her house. He doesn't own a car and doesn't have a driver's license. It's too far for him to walk. Had no means of getting to Linda Jensen's house. The fact that his supposed alibi that he gave couldn't really be corroborated at all. That's a pretty good clue at that point that this person may well be involved in the crime. Feeling the heat, Beard asks for a lawyer, and so another red light went on and he became higher on the list of suspects. The investigators in Tribune County really believe he did it, but with no solid evidence, investigators can't prove Beard's involvement. Another lead hits a dead end. Detectives also flew out to California to interview Silliman's third husband, but he was quickly cleared by alibi. By the summer of '92, 5 months after Linda's murder, the case goes cold. By 1999, Sherburne County had a new sheriff. He makes the unsolved Linda Jensen murder a top priority 7 years after her death. Bruce Anderson, who was one of the initial investigators in the case, had become sheriff, and he had made a promise to the family that he wouldn't retire until he solved it. Anderson and his investigators maintain a room dedicated to the Jensen case, and so they started a task force. First on the list for the Homicide Cold Case Unit is to revisit the DNA collected from the crime scene. This is the first case they ever had with DNA evidence. Initially, they couldn't use the DNA in this case. It's a very small sample. In the 7 years since Linda's murder, DNA testing technology has come a long way. They've got to the level in which they can take a little tiny bit and they can actually develop it into a bigger sample that they then use for testing. Now, armed with a DNA profile of the killer, police launch a search to find a match. Police collected somewhere around 80 DNA samples, including Charlie Jensen and Robert Beard, folks who at one point or another at least considered to be potential suspects. But no one is a match to the DNA taken from the seminal fluid found on Linda Jensen's leg. The police come up empty-handed at that point again. With no hits, investigators appeal to the public once more. There was a reward offered. The Cold Case Homicide Unit sets up a tip line and receives an anonymous call with a very promising lead. A man called in a tip said he had overheard a conversation with another individual at the gym about how Linda Jensen was killed. The tipster said the man he overheard discussing the details of Linda's murder is a bodybuilder named Richard Christie. Richard Christie belonged to the same health club that Linda Jensen had, so there was at least the possibility that the two of them may have interacted with each other. Investigators make a trip to the gym to speak with Christie, asked him about Linda Jensen, and he said he knew her, and in fact he said he thought they kind of had a thing. Christie has no criminal record, so investigators ask him for a DNA sample. If he's innocent, he's going to be eliminated. After 7 years, police believe they're on the verge of catching Linda Jensen's killer. But when the DNA test comes back, Christie is not a match. A few months later, a witness came forward with a shocking revelation. In June of 2000, a woman called the sheriff's office and said she had information about a man she'd been dating earlier in the 90s. His name was Kent Jones. The two had an extramarital affair, and she, during that time, had brought up the name Linda Jensen because, at the time, everybody was talking about the murder. Police checked his name, and he was a neighbor that kind of lived kitty corner a half-mile away from the Jensen's house. Investigators dig into Kent Jones's background. He's married, he's a Cub Scout leader, he's big into his church, but also he was charged with domestic abuse. Perked our interest, to say the least. Investigators dig out the statement given by Jones during the initial neighborhood canvass. He'd made a statement stating that he didn't know Linda Jensen and hadn't seen anything suspicious that day. Him about Linda Jensen, and he said he had no idea. He's never met her. And his wife says, well, you remember her. She came to our house because he was a Cub Scout leader and she wanted to talk to them about Joy joining the Cub Scouts. After that, he changed his story. He said that he saw her jog past the house every day and that he knew her as an acquaintance. The first impression of investigators that is really anxious and he's really nervous. He answers, oh, was that her? Jones has asked for a DNA sample, which would easily clear him as a suspect. And he said, no, I'm not going to give it. At this point, investigators already know that he did this or he did something else. He is in shook and he doesn't want to give DNA. A red flag for them. Based on the witness statement and his domestic abuse charge, police can secure a warrant for Jones's DNA. A few days later, they got a hit. Kent Jones is charged with the rape and murder of Linda Jensen. Detectives reconstruct what they think happened on that terrible day. Kent Jones had seen the victim on numerous occasions and talked to her, and they think he had fantasized about being sexual with Linda, and he decided to act out his fantasy. While he was sexually assaulting her, he strangled her. After she was dead and not moving, he pulled her off the bed, went and got a butcher knife out of the butcher block in the kitchen, came back, and then she was stabbed. He takes the comforter, puts it over the top, and drives that knife right back into that gaping hole. He lived out his fantasy, but he didn't get away with it. Kent Jones was arrested on July 25, 2000 for first-degree murder. A grand jury added 2 additional counts of second-degree murder as well as criminal sexual conduct in the first degree. The arrest shocked the communities. Kent had been heavily involved in the community. He had also been involved in his church, and everyone thought he was a good person, a good husband, and a good father. No one ever suspected him as a murderer. No one knew about his dark side. In November of 2001, Kent Jones stood trial for the murder of Linda Jensen. As hard as this senseless crime is to grasp, no one is ready for the bombshell about to drop. At trial, Kent Jones maintained that he had had a consensual sexual relationship with Linda Jensen. He said that they had had sexual relations on the day before the murder. Jones maintained his innocence despite the DNA results, and during the trial when he took the stand, he made a shocking claim. He stated that he and Linda had been having a consensual physical relationship and the two had been together the day before the murder, which he believed would have explained why his DNA was found at the scene. This angered Linda's family, who felt that he had taken Linda's life and now he was trying to take her reputation. The medical examiner disputed the claim by stating the condition of the sperm collected that day made it unlikely to have been over 24 hours old. After that, his lawyers tried to pin the blame on alternative killers, which included Robert Beard and a man from the fitness center Linda worked out at, but both were cleared with DNA evidence. Throughout the investigation and trial, Jones's story changed and evolved multiple times, so often that once he made the claims about being in a relationship with Linda, it might have been one too many for the jurors, who ultimately convicted him on all 3 charges. He was sentenced to life in prison, and this should have been the end of the case. But then, in 2004, Kent Jones filed for an appeal. He asked for a new trial because the first judge hadn't allowed him to present evidence that pointed to an alternative suspect to the jurors. The motion was granted, and Jones was released while a second trial began. In 2006, the second trial started. This time, his lawyers were allowed to present evidence that opened up the possibility that 2 other men could have committed the murder, despite DNA evidence clearing them. He also revised the timeline. He said that he and Linda had been intimate together the morning she was killed, but he had left before she had been murdered. He then also pointed the finger at Charlie himself, claiming that Charlie had discovered their affair and murdered Linda in a jealous rage. When he made this claim, those in the courtroom stated that Charlie was seething with rage and they were certain that things were coming to a boiling point. One of Kent's defenses was that he was, and this is a quote here, a skilled lover, and Linda found him irresistible. Kent's lawyers then called his wife Deborah to the stand to corroborate that he was a skilled lover, and then she, on the stand, said that he wasn't skilled at all. He certainly hadn't been skilled in convincing the jury because he was again convicted on all 3 charges and again sentenced to life in prison. A new medical examiner presented evidence for the prosecuting side, and this would become a huge issue later down the road. Dr. Michael McGee had been what was described as the premier medical examiner in the state and was often the first called to present evidence for trial. Working from 1985 to 2019, he was involved in 216 trial cases, which included multiple death penalty cases. With advances in DNA, many cases in Minnesota were getting appeals and retesting of evidence. In several cases, several convicted individuals had been found to be innocent after years in prison. A pattern began to emerge, and in many of these cases, Dr. McGee had been the medical examiner. In 2022, an independent audit revealed some shocking revelations about Dr. McGee and his office. For 35 years, Dr. McGee's office had been unchecked in a unique arrangement he had with the county. He'd been brought in as an independent contractor. His most recent contract had paid him almost $800,000 a year for his services. Since he was an independent contractor, not a public service employee, this meant that he wasn't subject to filing records and left him in a position where he was his own boss and no one examined or audited his work. It also meant that he wasn't subject to keeping his findings public records. This was highly unusual for the industry and really should never have been allowed to begin with. It was also determined that McGee often used unreliable or inaccurate tests and was in a position where he could doctor the evidence to whatever he needed. Many of his methods weren't industry standard and oftentimes were condemned by other medical professionals because they were so inaccurate. This is a medical professional hired and paid to present as accurate evidence as possible to make sure people have fair trials. At this time, it is unknown how many cases are being impacted, but several people are being awarded overturns and releases. One of those who were asking for release is Kent Jones, and whatever tests were run on the sample could ultimately have contaminated the evidence in Linda's case. 31 years later, the murder in Big Lake may become a mystery once more. Thanks in no small part to the medical examiner, everyone believed and few questioned. Unfortunately, Kent Jones could walk free or subject Linda's family to a third trial. Only time will tell what happens next. At this time, Kent Jones's next opportunity for appeal is in 2030. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. As always, if you want to support the channel, the easiest way is to hit the like button. You can also subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. Until next time.